You're listening to Accounted For, the Canadian podcast that explores the intangibles of every career. I'm your host, Daniel Lee. Hi everyone, this is your host, Daniel Lee here. And I wanted to give you some background on the actual podcast. So, I really like asking people what they do, and I've had jobs as a public accountant, a management consultant, and lately as a public equities investor. And in getting these roles, I had to speak to a lot of people who were already doing what I wanted to do. And it turned out that what the media and industry stereotypes say about the role is not at all accurate to what you actually do. And this was not to mention that most assumptions people said about a certain individual's journey into that career field was also wrong. This was because it's never as linear as people think it is. It's never as simple as you do A, then you go to B, and then you will get to do C. It's actually much more complicated than that, and that's what I realized after having spoken to over 80 different people to learn about what they did. And something I found out was that a lot of my friends had not learned this yet. Some eventually would because they have already started reaching out to people to actually learn about what they did. But I also knew that many wouldn't because cold calling people really frightened them, and that's completely understandable. It still scares me too. But I also am always extremely curious about what other people do, and I love hearing about their stories. So I figured maybe I can help them out with this podcast and just document what I would normally be talking about with other people. And so that's what this podcast is about. It's me finding people with career journeys that I find interesting, and or they have roles that I would like to learn more about. And so I really do hope that I can add value to you in that sense as I go about selfishly using this podcast to learn more about other people and fulfill my own curiosity. So yeah, there you have it. Today's interview is with Vikram Somasundaran. Vikram was a Deloitte consultant as well as a University of Waterloo alum, and that's how I got connected with him. And he is also a Y-combinator alum as well, the famed San Francisco startup incubator. And as you may have thought, given the prestige of Y-combinator, we do focus a lot on his startup that he has started and eventually sold to later on join CPA Ontario, which is where he is right now. So we go through the contrast of what it was like being in a corporate consulting environment to actually going through the whole startup phase, the ecosystem and Y-combinator, what it's like to be one of the co-founders, and the selling process, as well as the transition out. Like, what do you do after you've been in that kind of crazy startup environment? And so this has been super interesting in terms of getting a very unique perspective into a world that is receiving a lot of coverage in the media, but to hear it from someone who actually lived and breathed it. So I do really hope that you find a lot of value out of this one. All right. Today we're joined by Vikram Somasundaran. Did I pronounce that right?
Pretty good.
All right, thank you. Vikram is the vice president at CPA Ontario, but hidden behind this kind of corporate title, he's also a Y Combinator alum, and he has also started a startup called Edusight in his past. And so, Vikram, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and to begin off with, before we dive into your career journey, I wanted to go through what your childhood was like growing up.
Yeah, so I had a very interesting and fun childhood. I grew up in India until I was 13.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, and moved to Canada in 2001. Before that, my dad actually used to work in Venezuela. He was there for about 6 years.
Mm.
So a lot of my summers growing up, we spent in Venezuela. So a lot of traveling, and then the summers there were fantastic. So it was there's this expression called third culture kids, where it's basically second generation immigrants where you don't identify with any one culture really. And so I would put myself in that camp, growing up in India and Venezuela, seeing different parts of the world, and then moving here when I was 13. And then there's obviously the usual culture shock when you immigrate to a new country. I never had any issues with the language, thankfully, but it was much more around other cultural elements. And so that shaped a lot of who I am, adaptability, and being able to empathize with people of different cultures. That's probably one of my strongest skill sets. And I think it all came down to having that experience growing up in different parts of the world, in different cultures.
Wow, that's something I learned a new term here. Third cultured immigrants.
Third culture kids.
So third cultured kids.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess that identifies that too then. I never knew what I would call myself, because I was born in South Korea, and then I grew up there until 5, and then moved to Hong Kong, and I lived there 4 or 5 years, and then I came to Canada after that too. So, okay, no.
Yeah, and it's a very when I first heard the term, it resonated because you're not necessarily identified 100% with any one culture or any one heritage, and you pick up different pieces of your identity, and it shapes who you are. So I think there's obviously more and more people like that, especially in a place like Canada and in Toronto, where everyone's so diverse.
No, definitely, yeah. And so when you were young, what kind of dream careers did you have when you were a kid? Like when you were 7, 8 years old, people ask you like, oh, what do you want to be when you grow up? What did you think about?
Well, the career that was always sort of imposed on me was the classic doctor.
Okay, so even as a third cultured kid, you had that?
Of course, being someone of Indian descent, that was the classic high achiever expectation was, oh, you should be a doctor. But funnily, well, maybe not that funny, but I always wanted to be a lawyer.
Really?
So it was something that from when I was very young, it was just something that you watch TV shows or movies, and the idea of being able to persuade someone and at the same time do something with integrity was what I thought the legal profession was growing up, and in an idealized way, that's what I wanted to be. And so that was what I wanted to be from maybe as early as I can remember, 5 or 6 years old, to right up until I got into the professional world and saw what majority of lawyers, especially corporate lawyers, actually do day to day. And then I was like, maybe that's not what I want to do.
You made it seem almost as if you were being a rebel by saying, oh, my parents wanted me to be a doctor, but no, I wanted to be a lawyer.
Yeah, it was so rebellious. I paved my own path.
And if anyone looks at your LinkedIn profile, it starts out with University of Accounting, Deloitte Audit, Deloitte Consulting, and then your foray into startup with Edusight. But where did the disconnect with the lawyer begin? Was it during even applying to Waterloo alone? You applied to straight to an accounting program instead of a other kind of law school, but pre-law program.
Yeah. I would say I would summarize my career journey so far as mostly exploring.
Yeah. That's
what I would say. I'm very comfortable learning new things, adapting to new environments, and a very generalist skill set is my biggest strength. And so even though I wanted to potentially go into law school, the reason I picked the accounting program was actually I picked it for the math program. And the accounting was a backup because you can't become an academic in math. There's really no strong career path. So it was like, hey, I'll do accounting, so there's a professional aspect to it and a viable, long-term, secure career path as a backup. Then once you get into an accounting program and you're going through all the process of qualifying and all of those elements, you get sucked into that world, and very quickly you buy into a lot of the very valid positives of the profession.
Right,
which is the long-term security and The skill set will always be in demand. If you're in that bend, you do pick up a lot of strategic skills, analytical skills, and there's a lot of wealth of positives there. And when you first get in, you're sold on those positives.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went all in, and I was joined Deloitte in a co-op capacity in audit, and I got a tremendous amount of value there. Right, back to the skills I talked about, and then at some point along that path, I realized long term that's not what I wanted to do,
Mm-hmm.
and so there was one career aspect crossed off the list there, and then I continued exploring in other paths.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of took me to consulting, which was that's where a lot of people go for a broad perspective, right? So you want to be leading businesses, you want to learn a broad skill set, get exposure to a variety of industries, different types of problems. So all of those things attracted me to it.
Mm-hmm.
Again, explored, spent a couple of years, learned a lot, grew a lot, and then went to start my own company. Also, again, exploring, and in that particular jump, it was mostly about solving a very personal problem I was passionate about,
Mm-hmm.
which was around personalizing learning.
Mm-hmm.
Again, went and did that for a few years, learned by far the most, and grew a lot, and we can get into some of the experiences. But at the end of the day, we couldn't find a way to scale the business to where we wanted,
Mm-hmm.
in the way we wanted. And so we said, let's at least find a home for the phenomenal product we built.
Mm-hmm.
And so we found a buyer for the technology, and then I came here to CPA Ontario. And part of that was, again, exploring. My original goal in coming here was, this is on the surface, it sounds like a regulatory, old world organization that doesn't move fast.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of those kinds of challenges.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, it's a $100 million organization, 300 people, gone through a significant amount of change and still facing a significant amount of change, especially with things like technology and the way that might affect the profession.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this interesting old school organization caught in this place where they're forced to adapt and change fast. Otherwise, they're going to die out, not just as an organization, but potentially as a profession.
Right.
And so that was fascinating to me. And so the reason I came here was originally to learn at a leadership level how to run an organization of that size
Mm-hmm.
and scale. But then as soon as I got here, I realized the tremendous scope of challenges facing the organization. And that's what's kept me here,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because there's just so much to do to really help consider what the future holds for the profession, and then start to drive forward in a way that actually makes sense and builds a sustainable future for the profession. So,
Mm-hmm. No, I think you did an excellent job of summarizing your unique career path so far. And so if we were to, I guess, now kind of dig into a little more to the details of each part,
Yeah.
I think even the initial part of, you did audit and then you moved into consulting, and still, even though it was within the same company, from my experience with the Big Four, it's never as easy as it always seems, and people might think, oh yeah, of course, you can go into one and you can always make the transfer. But
Yeah.
for you, it was in effectively making the transfer into consulting. You joined the monitor group, and you effectively had to give up on the whole CPA path. Yeah,
that's
that
right.
you had hedged as like, I'll have that professional path, and you had kind of went all in on. And so, what was the decision making process like? I'm sure there was a lot of parts that could have made you think, made you maybe doubt your decision at times, or maybe like considering it even from your parents' perspective, what were they concerned with?
Yeah. There were a lot of, at the time, it seemed like such a world-changing decision.
Right, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
In hindsight, it really isn't.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is realizing, and I think this is how I've evolved over the course of time to realize that it's never, you get used to the sunk cost idea,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that frustrated me most, by that point in my career in audit, I'd done a few, that was my third busy season,
Mm-hmm.
even though I was still in school and as a co-op.
Yeah.
And everyone, once you get past that point, is disenfranchised, right? So there are a lot of people that love what they do and
Mm-hmm.
want to get the designation and plan to be a CPA in public accounting
Mm-hmm.
for their careers,
Mm-hmm.
right? But there's a lot of people that don't.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a pyramid model because it's a high leverage model, right? So you take in a lot of associates and junior analysts, and only a few of them advance
Mm-hmm.
in their careers, right? most of them will lead to other opportunities. And the thing I consistently found was all my friends who were in the same situation as me either didn't do the work to explore what they wanted to do, or were too stuck on, I need to stay till I earn my designation.
Right.
Because the designation opens up all these doors for me.
Yeah.
Right? And rightly or wrongly, that was the attitude. And for me, the struggle was really getting to a point where I realized the doors it opens may not be the doors I want to walk in through.
Yeah.
Right? And once I got to that point, then one, it opened up opportunities, and I didn't really care about the risk of not pursuing and following through on the designation, because to me that was an added bonus. Even when I switched over to the consulting side, at that point I was working with Deloitte to see if there was a way I could still earn my designation, but that was all an added bonus.
Yeah.
It turned out I couldn't, and I didn't particularly care. Right? But the more important thing is that then now carries through in all my decisions, right? It's mostly about what actually are the consequences of making a decision, and don't evaluate it based on a feeling of security or sunk cost, or, that's not the right way to evaluate a decision. And it sounds like a lot of common sense, but when it comes to your career and, potentially starving for a few months or not making a paycheck, there's a lot of emotional baggage wrapped up in those kinds of decisions. And at the end of the day, you trade off long-term career prospects, if things go right, for short-term security every time, or at least I do, right? And so that's what I learned from that process.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think it's quite common for people to, in general, I've done this too, where you over-exaggerate the short term and underestimate the actual potentials of what could be and what couldn't be. Yeah,
and it's the same thing in, it's especially important early in your career.
Yes.
Right? Once you're later in your career and at the same time you're starting to balance family and you have other obligations, then, it's very understandable your decision-making comes under different constraints. But when you're in your early 20s and you really have nothing to lose, at worst, you lose certain time. But the reality is you learn a lot more. Right? From that experience, you're exposing yourself to new things, you stretch your skill set, you will learn way more than if you stick with what's comfortable. And the trade-off, again, always works out in your favor, even if in the short term you lose out on money, on job security. In the long term, the skills you build and the experience you build will always make you stand out. So back to my example, in the worst case, I spent a year or two in consulting, didn't enjoy it. I could have always gone back down the CPA path, and I would have stood out when I reapplied to CPA-type jobs, because I would have had a different kind of experience and skill set that I would bring to the table, right? And that was something I didn't appreciate back then, but in hindsight, that makes me much more valuable as a candidate when I come back to any other kind of role.
No, definitely. I would definitely agree with that. And I think predominantly when you're younger, there's definitely that fear of missing out mentality in career too, where I think, like for me, I even had feelings of it when I left audit after 3 busy seasons, and I went to consulting, and even in consulting, and even when I jumped into the buy side, it was more, you'd see your friends and they'd be like managers at 26, and some of my friends, I would tell them, I urge them earlier on, hey man, you should leave, you don't want to do this stuff, you want to be a software engineer, you could be a software engineer, and they're thinking, I'm gonna miss out on that year, and then I'm gonna miss out on that title. But at the end of the day, you look at partners and stuff. None of the partners are counting. Oh yeah, dude, I made partner at 35. You made it at 37.
Yeah.
Right. I think in the long run, it just doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter at all.
Yeah.
And part of that, I'm gonna go on a bit of a tangent here.
No. Yeah.
Part of that is we're so used to, and this comes from my education experience. We're so used to every step of the way, from when you're 3 years old all the way till you're 22, every step of the way, someone's telling you this is a path.
Yeah.
This is the right next step. If you aren't advancing at this pace and following this right next step, you are a failure. The word failure is used, and it's not used in the context Silicon Valley uses it, where failure is a good thing and you learn and build. It's used in the context of you are worse than your peers, and you are less than your peers, right? And so when you've spent all your formative years in that kind of paradigm, and then you're faced with a career decision where all your friends and all your peers are advancing, quote unquote, right? And you don't advance in the same way, you are a failure in that paradigm of you are less than your peers.
Yeah.
And that's a huge level of programming that you got to unwind to be comfortable saying, it doesn't matter what my peers are doing, what my friends are doing, I got to make the decision that makes the most sense for me, and I got to think long term, and I got to think about skills, which is not how you're trained to think. You're trained to think in terms of grades and metrics and salary. But if you think about skills and long-term career, it's a very different kind of decision making than what you're used to, and it's a hard thing to do after 22 years of learning certain habits.
Yeah, and I think as someone who's already built a startup in the education role, you're probably very educated in this manner. But I just recently learned about how the current Western school system was developed. It's still following the same model that we had in the industrial ages, where the reason why we have summers off is not because they want to give kids a break, but it was because so kids could go back to the farms and just cultivate the crops. That's the only reason we have 2 months off in the summer.
Yep.
And we still follow that model where the entire model is just built to pump out obedient factory workers. That's why we have schedules and rules. And after you get pumped out of that, it's supposed to be, okay, now you're going to be a factory worker, go to the assembly line, which doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, and you could take it one step further. There's certain schools of thought today where majority of K-12 education, the primary function of society actually turns out to be daycare. Glorified public daycare, because the tactical skills and work level, experience you come out with is very little. If you come out as a 22-year-old student with no internship experience, with no real-world professional experience, you're at a significant disadvantage versus someone like a Waterloo co-op student who spends certain work terms actually building that skill set. Even though you might have all the same technical knowledge, from a professional standpoint, you're at a disadvantage. And then you fast forward 10 years, both of those candidates will probably remember about the same amount of all the education they learned over the 18 years of K-12 education.
100%.
Right? And so in the long-term view, the biggest benefit of K-12 education is keeping kids engaged, keeping kids developing mentally, physically, keeping kids off the streets. Those are far more real-world benefits. And again, I'm not saying this is necessarily my point of view, but that's an extreme point of view compared to the actual educational benefits when you're 30, 40 years old that you retain from those years. And then there's a social component too. Obviously, learning how to socialize with each other, building the social skill set, which you wouldn't get if you were homeschooled, for example, without the same level of socialization. So,
and this passion for education that you had, like where did it start getting cultivated while you were in consulting? Was it some kind of project that sparked it for you, or?
Yeah, it wasn't so much cultivated when I was in consulting as something I always cared about. So I'll go back to, talking about my childhood. One of the things that that really shaped me was building a sense of empathy. And so I always wanted to help people. I always understood where people were coming from, and what that made me really good at was teaching. So throughout elementary school, high school, university, I taught in a whole bunch of different capacities, whether that's one-on-one helping. In math class, a lot of times the teacher would just do a little bit. You know how math class used to work? They would do a 10-minute lesson, then give you work time.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Do your homework in class, yeah.
Yeah. Usually the work time was me walking around helping other kids.
Okay.
So it was something I enjoyed doing, and it was just something I was passionate about, right? And then what crystallized for me was every time I worked with someone one-on-one or in a very small group, they did far better. I could get them to be far more engaged because I could understand and empathize with what they did or didn't understand, and then tailor what I was teaching. And then when I was in consulting, my co-founder, he worked with me, Garris Lee, he was really intent on starting a business. So we would just on weekends brainstorm and talk about things that we were passionate about, and we went down a few different roads and like what are potential things. And then one day we just thought about we stumbled upon this idea of sports analytics, right? And the idea was like, okay, if you're a basketball player, back then, if you're an NBA fan, there's this system called Synergies, and back then it was very new. And it's a camera tracking system that tracks every second when a player's on the court, how often they hold the ball, how long they're holding the ball at each spot on the court, how often they pass, to whom they pass, under what kinds of scenarios, and all of that is just pure by data tracking, and then the analytics get pumped out of that. Right? And it's super valuable for coaching and learning and development. And so the moment of crystallization was, what if you could do something similar for education in K-12 students, and be able to get that level of insight and understanding in an automated way, so that each teacher would be equipped to personalize learning the same way I enjoyed doing in a one-on-one setting, right? not by any stretch of the imagination a new idea or even novel at the time. There was probably 20 to 30 companies easily at that point trying to, in the long term, do the same thing. But that really captivated us.
Yeah.
And so we started spending evenings and weekends looking at the market, understanding what was happening. We spoke to probably, dozens of teachers, probably close to 100 in our spare time, just reaching out to one by one, asking each teacher to meet us and then refer us to more teachers, and just understanding what they did on a day-to-day basis that we didn't understand from a student experience. And then how they thought about personalization, what were some of the barriers, what were some of the challenges. And, in a misguided way in hindsight, what it kept coming back to was technology and grading systems. And so we saw an opportunity where there just wasn't a good enough grade book. We would have learned later that was just a common theme for a variety of reasons. And so we started, doing mock-ups and getting more and more into it. And over the course of 3-4 months, we just reached a point where, having seen other people do it, we just realized we couldn't keep super high demanding full-time jobs in a career like consulting, where we were probably doing 60, 70 hours, right, a week, and do this on the side effectively.
Yeah.
So we just said, let's just quit. And it was back to the same decision-making model, right? Like, am I going to give up on short-term benefits? I'm going to miss out on salary. We were enjoying a healthy, amazing lifestyle, right, where you make decent money and with a lot of young friends, and you can go out and party, and you have all those luxuries. You trade all that off for a potential long-term benefit. And it came right back down to, are we going to be better for it from a long-term career perspective at the end of it? And there was zero ways in which we wouldn't be better, right? So for us, it was a very easy decision. And so we took the leap.
Okay. And at what point was it that, what point in the business did you feel that, okay, we need to actually devote 100% of our time into
It was very early. It was basically three to 4 months in.
Yeah.
And over those 3 to 4 months, we were doing evenings and weekends with, everything I kind of alluded to.
Right.
Talking to teachers, typical consulting fashion, looking at the market, looking at the market size, using the skills we had at the time, right? We also started going to technology meetups in Toronto, which at the time weren't very good.
Yeah.
It was still very early in terms of technology ecosystem here. So it's not like we met a whole bunch of amazing people, but we got to learn a whole bunch of principles around what starting a company in technology is like. And we were introduced to ideas like the lean startup and, just go test and iterate. And so we started doing those things. But like I said, we just quickly reached an impasse where you can't do that effectively while doing a demanding job. I know a lot of people have done it. I've seen a lot more fail at doing it. And so we just said, we're not going to take the chance. We're both fortunate enough that we could, take some time and afford not to get paid. I know a lot of people aren't in that situation. Thankfully we were, so we took the leap.
Yeah, I think it is a common theme where a lot of successful entrepreneurs, some will moonlight, like even Phil Knight worked as an accountant while he was setting up Nike, but it was because it was out of necessity. And after you hit the point where necessity is met, then you don't hedge, you just go all into giving it the full time. And so you and Garros are both consultants, and so you're both non-technical, trying to start a technology company. So how was the early part of the strategy building like, where you guys decided, to go off on your own and try to create some kind of technology company, like trying to create an MVP? What was the roadmap for that?
It was obviously the biggest challenge, and we knew from the beginning that was our first priority.
Okay, yeah.
So over the first, let's say, 3 to 4 months, we spent most of our time actually trying to find the right CTO. And we spent, we explored everything. We went to coding boot camps. We looked at contractors. We actually hired someone that didn't work out. But in the whole time, we were still continuing on the other path of talking to teachers and iterating on mock-ups. So with whatever crappy design skills we had, in PowerPoint, we were making slides that would replicate what a product could look like. Screenshots, right? And there's a funny story there, which about 2 months in, we went to this conference, education technology conference in Niagara Falls. and there was something like 1,500 teachers there.
Yeah.
And we just went with our PowerPoint slide mockups, and we'd animated it to look like if you click, you're clicking to a next screen.
Right.
And so it was just a video on loop of us clicking through certain screens.
Yeah.
And it was, in hindsight, fairly terribly designed.
Yeah.
But we were still able to win most innovative startup just from that, because we had a little booth and we did that, and we talked to a lot of teachers and got them engaged. And, you know, there's an element of, there was a voting piece to it. So a lot of it was also because we just went out and talked to a lot of teachers.
Yeah.
Right. So we got them to vote for us. But the reality is, again, the funny story is we had nothing. We didn't have a CTO. We didn't have any kind of MVP. This was all just built from talking to teachers, understanding what they were saying, and translating that to some level of, you know, designed mock-up, right?
Yeah.
So that was super encouraging for us, only because it just felt like we were stumbling onto a real problem.
Right.
That even with a really shitty solution, people were responding to positively, right?
Yeah.
And so then, you know, the next couple of months after that, we lucked into finding our two other co-founders who were technical co-founders.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, I think it's a combination of we spent a long time doing it, and then we lucked into finding the right people.
Mm-hmm. And I think we bypassed this, but, you know, this company that you guys got together to co-found is Edusight, and I know what the company is, but I don't think we've actually explained to the audience what the company actually did. So if you were to describe the company, what was the purpose of it, and what value did it serve?
Like many companies, we went through many evolutions of product, but at the end of the day, the goal was personalizing learning.
Mm-hmm.
And the simplest way of putting it is we wanted to make it easy for teachers to capture data about their students within their existing workflows in the classroom, so that we could then tailor insights and give them insights on how to personalize learning for their kids.
Mm-hmm.
So we started with a gradebook, because like I said in the early conversations, everything came back down to really crappy grading tools.
Mm-hmm.
So we started there, and over the course of a few months to the first couple of years, it evolved into a broader portfolio type tool where you could capture any kind of data. You could capture voice notes, you could capture photos, videos, and it became more of a portfolio tool where grades were just another type of data, right? So that was eventually where the product ended up, and the place where we reached a point where we realized we couldn't scale anymore was early enough where we didn't think we could effectively deploy anything sophisticated to start the automation or around the intelligence, right? So our insights were more still giving teachers visualization so they could do their own insights, and we had some creative visualization that didn't exist, but that was really where we got to. Yeah.
And, you know, so you and Gareth both quit your jobs, and a few months later, you know, you win a competition and eventually get your two CTOs, and a few months after that, you get into Y-combinator.
Yeah.
And, you know, that is the holy grail of, I think, accelerators and incubators in North America, at least.
Yeah.
And so you get there, you know, it's a lot of your friends probably told you, all right, you made it, it's all going to work out well. And I remember, though, you were telling me about that period, and you're saying, oh, no, you're like, we had 4 guys and a one-bedroom apartment in San Fran, and practically some days we'd just be waking up, working, eating, working again, eating, then sleeping, and you just repeat the process over and over again.
That was most days,
Yeah. And I think that's the reality of what it actually takes to actually go through that kind of process.
That's right. And so a couple of things. We actually applied a few times to Y-combinator before that and didn't get even an interview. And actually where we got in was not Y-combinator at the time. It was Imagine K-12. So Imagine K-12 was an education incubator started by a Y-combinator partner, Jeff Ralston, and Tim Brady. And it was basically exactly like Y-combinator, just focused on education. And we still had the Y-combinator loose network because Jeff was a partner at Y-combinator as well. And it was all done under Paul Graham's blessing. So, you know, it was always an unofficial affiliation with YC. And then a couple of years later, they officially merged. And Imagine K-12 is now the EdTech vertical within Y-combinator.
Gotcha.
Right? So retroactively, we still get all the benefits of being YC alum, or most of the benefits. And so, you know, at the time, we were at a point where we applied to YC a couple times and didn't get in. And then we stumbled onto Imagine K-12, and it took us a couple of times to realize that wait a minute, Imagine K-12 is actually what we want.
Yeah.
Because it's super focused on education.
Yeah.
And it'll be companies that we could learn from and, way more our speed, right? In terms of what we wanted. So when we finally got in there, that was amazing. And it was exactly like you described. There was like a lot of people saying, oh, congratulations, that's amazing. This is this is success, right? And one of the many lessons you learn as an entrepreneur is success is never when other people tell you you've succeeded, right? Because they will tell you you've succeeded many times along the way, whether that's hiring employees, whether that's getting into some kind of accelerator, whether that's raising funding, whether that's some sale, right? So a lot of times, early days, it was validation when you post something on social media, like, we're going to Silicon Valley to spend 6 months, and you get, the whatever number of likes and comments, and it's like, yes, that feels so gratifying.
Quick hit of dopamine, and you go, all right.
Quick hit of dopamine. But it's never real.
Yeah.
Because it's not real success yet.
Yeah.
And so to your question about what it was actually like, then it was, once we got to Silicon Valley, it was, to be fair, it was an extension of what we were already doing in Toronto.
Right.
Garris had, again, was fortunate that he had bought a condo previously. And so we were all just spending time in that condo in Toronto.
Yeah.
And then when we moved to Silicon Valley, we found a apartment that we shared. And it was actually a 3-bedroom apartment.
Oh, okay.
But 2 of the bedrooms were taken up by another Imagine K-12 founder and his sister. So they had a bedroom each.
Yeah.
And then we shared the 1 bedroom.
Right.
And I slept in the living room. So the 4 of us shared 1 bedroom. And we bought cheap, like $25 IKEA mattresses that were just rolled out foam. And so in the 1 bedroom, it was just 3 mattresses side by side on the floor with crappy pillows. And no one spent time there except when they slept.
Yeah.
And then in the main floor, we'd set up like 4 desks. And those are, again, $25 IKEA desks. So of the $20K or whatever funding we got, a good portion of that went to rent. And about, $300 probably went to furniture. And that's it. And then, some of it for food to sustain us for 6 months.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, at this point, you've still given up the lucrative salaries.
Yeah.
And you're there with 20K of funding from, I'm imagining that was K-12, Imagine K-12. And what motivated you guys to continue going at it like this? Because this is a big change of lifestyle from, especially, white-collar consulting jobs, where, getting an apartment, not normal, like not uncommon for your friends to all have an apartment.
Yeah. Honestly, it never even registered for me.
Yeah.
I never actually felt much negativity around that lifestyle change. And maybe that's, again, going back to, I kind of had that kind of lifestyle growing up anyway, where it was like a lot of moving. And then Waterloo, you're familiar with how the co-op system works. You're always moving.
Oh, yeah. Every 4 months?
I had it down to a science. So when I moved in Waterloo, I usually always looked for crappy furnished apartments. And I would just move myself. So I would borrow my parents' car. Everything I needed would be in, the back seat in the trunk. I would drive to Waterloo myself, unpack within 2 hours, drive back to where, Brampton, where my parents lived, drop the car off and come back. So generally I was pretty good at like living very minimally and being super adaptable. So for me, this was just, okay, I lived minimally and super adaptable in a nice Toronto apartment where it was furnished and I didn't own anything. And then when I moved to Silicon, and then, first when I moved to Garris's place, it was the same thing. I just lived on his couch. And then when we moved to Silicon Valley, it was just an extension of that, right? So I think all those kind of helped to reduce any of that negativity. But I think what kept us motivated was, again, just talking to teachers and the users. And at Imagine K-12 and YC, the mantra is you do nothing but eat, sleep, talk to users, write code, and repeat. That's it. The time you spend in either of those programs that's what you're supposed to be doing all the time, right? Everything else is a distraction. And I think we did that really well. Where all we did was I was either at home working on things with the team, or Garris and I would be out talking to teachers while the other 2 guys are CTO and they were just developing and writing code. Every once in a while we tried to get them out to go take a break, like maybe you guys should come to some classrooms and observe too.
Right.
And other things like that. But, yeah.
That's the break, right?
Yeah. And I think it was just, again, the motivation was purely slow but painful but steady rise in user numbers and the feedback we got, seeing the updated product, pushing new features, getting feedback on the new features. Like that's similar to the dopamine hit from social media, but it's tied to we're actually making progress towards what we're trying to achieve. So I think that was the biggest motivation. So, yeah.
And during this time, I think it wouldn't be uncommon to even have moments of doubt or like fear as you're building out this company.
Yeah.
And for you, what instances made you feel these kind of doubts kind of hit you, and or even like when would it hit you?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of key moments of doubt. One was, as with any founding team, we had our arguments and conflict, right? We were never at a point where we didn't get along,
right?
But a couple of us especially liked to argue. So I said I wanted to be a lawyer. Part of that was because I enjoyed heated discussion, right? And I think there were a couple of points where the other guys weren't as comfortable, and it created this dynamic and tension. And so we just talked through it and developed as a team, and that made us stronger. But that was one early challenge. And again, a lot of founding teams will go through their version of that. As with any team, if you want to get to high performing, you need to figure out what your dynamic is and what the issues are, and then work through those. And so we were able to do that. And then the other piece I would say is, and this, if you draw a straight line through reasons why we weren't able to scale and reasons why we had initial doubts, there was probably a lot of the same themes. So as much as we had the questions we had initially around, is this actually going to work?
Yeah.
Probably were a lot of the same questions at the end. And so we tried to pivot and iterate and try different models and tried a lot of things to get around it that we thought would work. We saw some measure of success along the way with certain paths, but at the end of the day, it was the same questions. So I would say even early on, we had a couple of moments of, is this actually going to work?
Yeah.
I'll even go back to before Silicon Valley. On day one, when Garrus and I quit, we were sitting in his living room, and for whatever reason, we had dived even deeper, and it's probably just the mental freedom of not having to focus on anything else, along with we had officially quit and it was hitting us. When we were like, literally on that day, did we make a huge mistake? And that was on day one, because a lot of the questions we were asking, we didn't have great answers to. And I don't think those were the same questions at the end, but I think there was a lot of moments of doubt like that.
Yeah. I think I'm kind of experiencing it for the first time since this has been about 3 months since I've been in my white collar job with the cushy salary, and I think last week while I was going through more of scheduling these podcast interviews, I had like a panic attack, and I was thinking, what am I doing? Yep. And it was even worse because a recruiting firm had reached out about a VC opportunity, and they named the salary figure, and I was like, oh wow, all right. Yep. I told them no, and then after that I was like, God, really?
Am I making a big mistake? Yeah.
And I think, but I think it's been reassuring to hear more that this kind of doubt just doesn't go away until even the later stages as well.
Yeah, and back to the same message, right? If you think about your situation, trying something entrepreneurial, meeting some entrepreneurial people, building that network will ultimately make you a better VC than if you were to take that job today.
Yeah.
And as much as VC is super hard to get into, a year from now, 2 years from now, there'll still be VC jobs around.
Yeah, definitely.
So you will be stronger for it in the long term. So.
Yeah. Thank you for the words of encouragement. And so then for you, for Edusight, when did you first hit your first sale? When you guys actually started generating cash flow, and what was that like? The process getting it?
It was funny. We actually hit that before we went to Imagine K-12.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So it was also super early. We hadn't launched a product officially. And this was all because I think we had 300-400 pre-signups before launch.
Wow.
And we were targeting September 2014 for launch with the new school year. And it was all because we kept talking to teachers in Toronto and building that network. And at one point, I think Garris posted on some, I want to say it was a Catholic Teachers Association group on Facebook. Or it might have been, oh, no, you know what? It was actually a meetup group. So Garris posted on a meetup group for teachers. And a technology teacher from a private school reached out and just said, hey, I've seen you guys post and I like what you're doing. Let's talk. And this was in the spring before September 2014. And we were nowhere close to a product that was ready. So over multiple meetings with him, with faculty at the school, with the headmaster, we showed them what we had and we showed them where we were going and what we would have by September. And they signed a pilot deal. And it was like, super small. It was something like $1,000, and they'll do it in grade 9. And they'll test it out for the year. And we put in certain other parameters. If it goes well, we'll do X, Y, Z. And that was one, it was super validating, but two, it was a huge win for us because they then became our biggest champion, our biggest supporter, and we did everything we could to like win them over, satisfy them. It was the first customer, and they ultimately brought in all of our private school customers in the future in some way, shape, or form because they knew everyone in Toronto, all the private schools, and that was super lucrative for us, right? All because they saw our evolution, they saw us grow as, business people, as leaders, as product people, and we delivered whatever we said we were going to deliver, right? So before we even got to Imagine K-12, before we launched, we actually got the sale, and then we just kept executing to meet that sale and then scale the product from there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And
sorry, back to the earlier point, that was again validation that we were onto something, right? And that was super motivating. Without even having a product that was launched, we were able to sell someone, right? So yeah.
But I think that it's the result of the constant actual talking and speaking to customers that I think definitely brought up that kind of result, like the kind of hustle that people talk about.
Yeah.
And I think, like some people assume that, no, you have to have a good enough, clean product first before you ever even talk to the customer.
Right.
But and I think that's just been a testament of like the result of all the groundwork that you guys had to put in earlier on.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so now you have customers at pre-launch, and after Imagine K-12, you start continuing to scale, and you go through your first round of financing.
Yeah.
And I believe at this point, you probably heard a lot of stories or people saying, all right, you guys made it. You did your first round of financing.
Yep.
Congrats. But what was that like now, even while you're scaling? Did it stop being the kind of go constant mindset, or did it actually accelerate further?
I would say it accelerated further. So a couple of themes. One, surprisingly, we actually didn't get a lot of super, you're successful response, partially because it was not a venture round, right? It was an angel round. Most of it came from one angel who was not like a super prominent angel. I mean, back then there weren't even really that super prominent angels in Toronto in 2014, early 2015. There were a few, but if you weren't raising money from those sources or from a venture round, it's not like we had a big announcement or like, it was super high profile, right? So for us, that was a good thing because we avoided all that noise. The double-edged sword aspect of that is then we had, we weren't as high profile as a startup as some of the other companies in Toronto.
Right.
And part of that was also because we'd just come back from 6 months in Silicon Valley. Yeah. Where it's, again, we weren't known to people here. Before that, we were in a, apartment. And then when we come back, we were able to go get workspace and all that stuff, but we didn't have a high profile, right? So thankfully, we actually didn't go through that faux success phase.
Right.
But regardless, it just put a timer, right? We had effectively gotten a few users, we'd gotten a couple of sales, and we'd proven that there was some level of demand for the product. And now all the closing the funding did was, prove that it's real product market fit. And we weren't even at the point where we were thinking about, prove that this is a billion-dollar company yet. This was it was basically an angel round. And so we weren't even at a post-seed, like, okay, we've got a model working. We were still we got to find product market fit. And so it just put a lot of pressure on us to be careful about how we spent the money, don't burn through it fast. So we built we were very judicious about building a long runway. We still used free space as much as we could. Like, we didn't go hire a crazy number of people until we could be confident that we found product market fit. And so that was very, very, it was a high level of pressure, but it was a good level of pressure. And it's the right kind of incentive to keep us going. Yeah.
And when you selected this angel investor, was it a kind of, you were vetting different angel investors and you picked the one that could add the most value to you, or was it just anyone that's going to give us the most amount of money?
It was more the latter.
Yeah.
And I think that was a lot of function of, so we made one mistake, which was we raised too early. And by that I mean, another Imagine K-12 alumni who was super helpful to me in giving me advice in fundraising, he said, don't raise until you have leverage. It's all just a game of leverage, right? If you don't have leverage, just stick it out until you do have leverage. And at that stage, what leverage means is you want to be the top company in your graduating class from your incubator, for example, right? You want to have the sexy metrics. You want to have people chase after you. That's the leverage you want to build, because that puts you in a strong position. And it's especially easier to do at that stage because you haven't raised money, you don't have a bloated team, you don't have any real expenses, and you can stay lean, right? And the mistake we made was thinking we had leverage because we were still probably closer to the top of the Imagine K-12 batch, and we thought the market was hotter than it was.
Oh, okay.
Right? So we kind of misestimated how much leverage we actually had. And the reality was we really didn't have any leverage. And so it was a combination of all of those things that kind of led us to, we met with a lot of VCs, we met with a lot of angels, and we weren't able to close a significant amount from a wide group of angels or even VCs, right? And so at that point when we were able to close this, it was like a huge win. It was like, great, we'll take it. And we got to keep going back to work. And it wasn't, to be fair, that it's not like this angel was not a value add or wasn't a great investor, right? It's just that we weren't in the position where we could pick our investors, right? And so there's an element of luck. There's an element of we happened to be in the right place at the right time. What we were doing resonated a lot, and they really believed in us as a team. So all of those things played into it.
And in terms of the right place, right time, now your company grows and it gets to the point where you've decided to sell the company because of extenuating market circumstances where you're talking about how there didn't seem to be a fit existent. And so when was the first indication that was apparent for you?
Yeah, so to my earlier comment about once we raised money, then it was about going to find product market fit. We never found product market fit. So after we raised money, we spent a year trying to build revenue, sustainable revenue, high growth, and we couldn't get there. We definitely grew and we definitely had more revenue and users. All of the things were happening, just not at a pace that would indicate this is a unicorn type company or a super high growth startup. Right? And so I would say maybe 10, 11 months in, we were maybe 15, 18 months, somewhere in that range of runway left.
Okay.
Because we'd really, like I said, we really stretched it out. So we still had the luxury of runway, but it was, okay, we're at this point and we don't have product market fit. And we just had a lot of honest conversations and said, okay, we're going to cut everything else we're doing and we're going to spend 2 to 3 months. All we're going to do is understand why do people come to us? We're still growing. We're still selling. Why are people buying our product and why are people using our product? If we don't have product market fit, what's the real value? And for a month, that's all everyone in the company did, was talk to teachers, talk to a whole bunch of people, observe, and obviously we still track metrics in a more passive way otherwise, but we were super diligent about trying to get to the bottom of it. And what we found was our product was the most intuitive and well designed, right? But it wasn't enough of improvement for them to abandon any of the other products, right? And so there was a lot of misaligned incentives, other massive companies that have much bigger products that have gradebooks as a feature, that people just did it because it was convenient.
Right.
And so we had to face a hard reality that unless we added something that would be a carrot for people to switch, we weren't going to get there. And then so we tried a few different carrots for the decision makers. And again, it's not like we weren't trying some of these things before, but we just doubled down and put a lot more effort and changed our focus as a company. And that matters a lot because it shifts, it gets everyone aligned behind different goals, right? And so we tried a few different models, and then we really thought there would be one model that was, okay, this is very elegant. It actually meets all the incentives. It does a lot of things. And we're hearing a lot of, again, positive, high demand from people we talk to at the school boards. But then we also said we got to be realistic, right? If this doesn't work, then we don't really see a path to finding that product market fit that's going to make us a rocket ship and that's going to scale us to the hundreds of millions in revenue and that kind of scale.
Yeah.
Because this was the only model we hadn't tested yet. And so we doubled down. We spent 4 to 6 months building things, testing that out, and we didn't see the results we wanted. And we hadn't even set super ambitious goals on the results. We just wanted to accelerate sales, and we weren't seeing that. And at that point, again, context is we could still, at the pace we were going, at the trajectory, we could have probably raised one more round of funding. We could have probably built the company to be a 5 to 10 million annual revenue business. But I couldn't see a path beyond that.
Yeah.
Right? And the question became, at that scale, one, is that what we personally wanted? And two, from a business standpoint, our vision was to personalize learning. Would we be able to get there?
Yeah.
And at that scale, you just don't have the user base and the data to build some of the, machine learning and automation and algorithms that we really wanted to build. So those were the two pieces that we came to realization on. And so we said, okay, we don't think we can get where we want, both from a personal or a business side. So it's time to get out of this and to exit.
And I think there definitely is there's a survivorship bias. I think that's overly exaggerated in the media, where you hear about all these founders. Okay, they started a company, we got bought up by this giant, we got bought up by that giant, and then they're like, I had money, so I started a venture fund, or I started angel investing, or I just put that into building another startup, and that's like Elon Musk doing all that. But and prevalently, when I talk to some of my friends, and I'm sure you might have heard from some of your friends too, in like the more professional services world, some of them will say, "Oh yeah, I think maybe I'll just quit and I'll just go start a company and then sell it after 5 years."
Right.
Easier said than done. And I don't think people really who sell it start out with the mentality of, I'm going to start it and I'm going to sell it after 5 years. It's just more naturally like you guys, where you guys wanted to go some certain place. It didn't seem realistic, and it just happened to be sold.
Yeah, I think there's a couple elements there. One is, in current startup culture, it's not noble to start a company with the intention of selling it.
Yeah.
Right? It's basically looked down upon and stigmatized, right? Your goal should be to build a unicorn, to build the next Uber, to build the next Facebook. And if you're not aiming for that, you're not building a startup. Paul Graham from YC defines a startup as high growth. And if you're not aiming for high growth with those kinds of aspirations, it's not a startup. And this is so built into thinking that it's just what wins out, right? So I don't know if the reality is most people, if this kind of stigma or expectation didn't exist, that most people would think that way. Right. Another element is that's somewhat predicated on the VC model. The way most venture funds work and make high returns is they need their investments to become like an Uber or a Facebook or a Stitch Fix or any of those companies that get to an exit like an IPO that's a 10x, 100x multiplier.
Right.
Not a 5x, 3x double, right? So when you have all those incentives, basically, if it's really hard to confidently and openly say, I'm going to start a company and my goal is to sell it, and align that with, I'm going to build $1 billion company. If you say it, and if you even set out to go, I'm going to start a company and my goal is to sell it, you're naturally going to have a harder time raising money. You're naturally going to think smaller. Your incentives, the way you build your company is different because the goal is to extract cash flow, right? The goal isn't to think long term. The goal is to think 5 to 10 years to make it an attractive buyout target. And I'm not placing value judgments on any of this, by the way.
Right. Yeah.
That's just the reality of how it is.
Yeah.
And so if you start out looking to sell a company, you can absolutely be successful at that. But the types of industries you do, the types of cash flows you generate will be, it fits a lot more with the classic entrepreneur hustler mentality from 20 years ago. So entrepreneur is now this sexy term. 20 years ago, entrepreneur was the guy that didn't have his shit together and was just always trying new ideas in the hope of, making money, right? And so the most classic thing is the lemonade stand. You find a need, you go fill it, and you make some money, right? So if you're looking to sell your company in 5 years, the best way to do that is find a niche, find a high cash flow business where you can quickly fill that niche without super high levels of investment and milk that revenue and profitability. If you can build a profitable high cash flow business, you can, and obviously with the understanding that you also think about who the buyers would be, then you could probably get there.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of companies, and you could potentially do something like that if you were 3 years ago in something like ad tech, where there's a lot of commoditized spaces, and you just need to find the right niche and execute super hard to build your customer base and build your revenue and profitability. You can't do that in something that requires a long-term vision and commitment. Right. So all of that to say in a long-winded way, there's nothing wrong with looking to set out to start a company. It's just, if you're doing that, you got to be very clear about it. And the type of business you build will not be the type of business, generally speaking, that gets the high-profile attention, that gets the sexy VC rounds, and is one of those companies on the hot lists to watch out for, right? You will probably end up with a under-the-radar company that will probably be a very healthy business if you do it right. But it's just a very different incentive system, and you got to know what you're doing.
Yeah. And so now you and your team have sold Edusight, and you received money and time back, and your co-founders and you have all split. Garros, you mentioned, is now at Harvard doing his MBA.
He will be in the fall,
soon. And your other co-founder, I think you said he started his own company.
Yeah.
Continued down the continuous startup path.
Yeah.
And for you, you've selected to join CPA Ontario. But I know before that you also mentioned briefly about potentially going to venture investing yourself.
Yeah.
And so what was the thought process there where, instead of starting another company like your other co-founder, were going to do an MBA, which is a very common, I think, route that a lot of people take.
Yep.
Your decision to do something different, what was that process like?
Yeah, so I did a really poor job right after we exited of taking stock of my options and taking time. I just jumped in and tried things, which, I mean, in some ways is good, but I think even then I knew it was probably the wrong thing, and in hindsight I know it's the wrong thing, only because it creates this... You don't take the time to reflect on what you've learned and really take stock of what you care about.
Right.
I eventually got there, but I created a fake pressure and timeline of myself, mostly because I was restless and I just wanted to try things.
Yeah.
Right. Venture was one of those things, and I fell into a little bit of a trap where every opportunity that came along, I thought, I could justify why I should do that.
Right.
Right. And venture was it's totally a fit with my skill set and how I think and all those kinds of things and my experience. I interviewed, I had a couple of offers. The reality was it just wasn't what I expected in a day-to-day, right? Because venture is super commoditized. And to be successful, you need the pipeline, you need the reputation, and it's a high percentage of it is sales.
Right, yeah.
And if you're either at the associate or analyst level, a high percentage of it is analysis, which is great. Well, it's great from what I wanted. But in the long term, it's a high percentage of it is sales, right? And whether that's marketing your firm, building the right content, there's a lot of tactics that firms use to build their pipeline. And the most successful ones are just great marketers and salespeople, right? So that realization kind of took me away from thinking of it as a long-term path. To be fair, then I also again, was fortunate enough that I could start a small fund with a couple of my friends. So, we've made a few investments, and we have a portfolio of venture investments that we've made. So I think that's my way of still being in the space and learning and staying connected and building my network. And we may play around with different iterations of that down the line. But for now, it's a small fund that we've made our investments with already, right? And so I tried that until I decided it wasn't for me. And then back to, CPA Ontario opportunity came up. And it made a lot of sense for, again, trade off the short term versus long term skills I learn, what benefit I get out of it. And at the time, it was as simple as there's a great executive here who I met and was impressed with and wanted to learn from. It was a $100 million organization, 300 people, a scale I've never helped lead. I've been a consultant for companies like that or organizations like that, but I've never helped lead an organization like that.
Right.
And it's an organization dealing with a huge amount of change and transformation culturally and externally. So all of those things made it interesting. Yeah.
And for you, in terms of, though you said in hindsight that you might have rushed into certain things, do you feel then that in hindsight, if you had known what you did now, would you still have gone to CPA Ontario, or do you think?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I actually don't think if I'd taken time off and this opportunity came up, I don't think I would have done anything differently. The difference, I think, is what it did was the first couple of months, I was, like I said, entertaining every option. Right. And part of that is also like the startup culture in you, right? You test and iterate, and you just go talk to people.
Right.
Explore. So that's what I was doing, and explore, right? Yeah. There's just a phase in between that I missed, which is reflect.
Right.
And you just need to take some time off. And I didn't do that very well, so, yeah.
Yeah, I think I experienced that early on after immediately came back to Toronto after quitting my job at the hedge fund, and just information overload. All these options hitting you. Yeah. And it can actually be a little depressing. Sometimes people might say, "Oh, poor you have so many options," but no, at the same time, it's very conflicting.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's right.
Yeah, no, I can definitely understand that. And okay, so now you're at the CPA, and you previously mentioned how you're, taking on positions as like a technological thought leader, given your background as well. And yeah, I'm personally curious on what is it like being in the inside of the CPA, where from the outside I'm seeing potential disruption coming to this kind of profession, where you see people who choose to go to boot camps, take on more technical roles in the engineering spaces. Do you feel that kind of impact?
Oh, for sure. And, it's a reality that everyone here is aware of. And we understand the potential for disruption from different types of technology, whether that's blockchain, even though it's super early, or whether that's automation and machine learning, which is much farther along, and the applications just aren't as crystal clear yet, but we know they're coming, right? The part of what I'm looking to do here is push action. It's one thing to know that those disruptions are looming, but it's another to take some kind of action. And so, again, the executive team here is really strong, and they are looking to also take action. So I'm not like a lone wolf by any stretch of the imagination. So that's the good news. The tougher part is it's a countrywide profession. So CPA Ontario is not a lone actor either, and there's a huge level of influencing with CPA in the Atlantic region, and with the national body, and with CPA in British Columbia. And each of those organizations would feel this disruption in different ways. So here we have the fortune of being in Toronto, which is a blockchain hub and an AI hub. And everywhere you go, people talk about those things.
Right. Yeah.
And we meet people, and we talk to leaders in those companies, right? Who also, many of them are CPAs.
Right.
And so for us, it's very real.
Yeah.
If you're in Charlottetown, and this is all super conceptual, right? And nothing against Charlottetown. That's just, it's not a hub for any of these things.
Yeah, just
right?
facts.
And so there's a difference in the level of urgency across the country that's felt about these things.
Yeah.
There's a difference in the level of resources because again, Ontario accounts for almost half the profession. So there's 200,000 odd members, CPAs in the country, and 45,000 of them are in Ontario. So it's an outsized level of resource and exposure we have compared to some of the other provinces. So it's easy to say we can move faster, but one, it's not clear what action needs to get taken. We have some ideas, and we're going to test them and iterate. But two, it's not us by ourselves. So we have to bring the professional along. We have to influence everyone. We have to show them the reality. And again, it's our conception of the reality, right? But we also can't afford to do that slowly.
Yeah.
Right? If we take 5 years to respond, it's too late. And so we're gone through an extensive process. We're working with all the different stakeholders from the different parts of the profession across the country. And, we're moving on that. But I think one tactical piece that I'm leading, which is part of, again, what also brought me here, is thought leadership. So it sounds like there's a way to do thought leadership that's an empty calories phrase, where it's you put out some papers and nothing happens from there.
Yeah.
My goal and our goal is to build the team here to be able to actually take action. So we put out a paper on cryptocurrencies a couple of weeks ago, and the role CPAs can play in that industry and in that space. And so far, we don't have the team to build on it.
Yeah.
But ideally, we'd be doing more advocacy around it, more events around it.
Right.
We'd be working with, leaders in the space, and a few CPAs that are leaders in the space. I've already started having conversations with them to come in and, one, educate members, two, then start to figure out how is the profession going to evolve, and as a result of that, what are the things we need to be doing to advocate, whether that's with government, whether that's with, employers, whether that's with students, and start taking action. So in the long term, the idea is that thought leadership becomes a beachhead where you start exploring these emerging issues and then filtering that into how you run the profession, right? And we're not there yet, but it's the first step.
Yeah, definitely. And so then for you, is a potential another startup in the running in your future, do you think? Or are you kind of all juiced out from that?
No, I'm never, I don't think juiced out is the right phrase. For me, I think it's always been about the problem.
Yeah.
I've never felt super confined to the definition of an entrepreneur. My goal isn't, or never was, to start a company. My goal was just to do interesting work and solve interesting problems. And so when we started Edusight, it just happened that we stumbled into something where I was super passionate about it, and we found a real problem that felt like wasn't being solved right, and we could see a way to solve it that would be different and could add value. We did do all those things, we just couldn't find a way to scale that. And ultimately the value passed on to Nelson, who bought our product and our technology. I don't feel, now I'm super wrapped up in this current problem, which is how do you sort of guide this profession of accounting and finance in Canada into the future that's super uncertain.
Right.
Regardless of anyone's best efforts, there may be a world where it is not as prosperous as it is today.
Right.
Or there may be a world where everyone becomes much more sophisticated because the value of judgment is much higher in a future world. And we're able to actually build in a lot more judgment in this profession. And we, 20 years from now, maybe the stereotype of an accountant isn't the boring number cruncher, right?
Yeah.
So that's a whole spectrum of potential outcomes, and I don't know where we land. But right now I'm enjoying trying to figure that out and to move towards solving that problem, right? So I'll say if I ever become an entrepreneur again, it would be that there's a problem that fascinates me and I don't see a way to solve it aside from starting a company. And that would be what motivates me to start a company.
No, yeah, definitely. And as we get close to the end of this interview, if your 20-year-old self will look at you now, so the Vikram of third year Waterloo, let's say, saw where you are at now and what you've done, what do you think the emotional reaction would be?
That's a great question. I would say probably ambivalence.
Yeah.
That sounds negative. It's not really negative. I don't think it's because I've just taken a path I would have never foreseen.
Right.
Right. I think it's I would be pretty happy with where I am, and I actually asked myself a different version of that question, and I'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
But for 20-year-old me, I would be pretty happy with where I am, but I just wouldn't have expected it.
Yeah.
Because at that point, I think I still believed I would do a couple of years of consulting. Actually, at that point, it was before consulting. So I might have still believed I would get my CPA and then who knows what.
Right.
So it would have been completely foreign to me.
Yeah.
But I would still be happy. The question I ask myself usually is, what would 15-year-old me that had a part-time job at McDonald's, and I still remember distinctly a conversation with one of my coworkers that was talking about their sister who was a CPA and was making like $70K a year.
Yeah.
And to me that was, oh man, that is so amazing.
Yeah.
To me that was success. And not that that's not success,
right.
But for 15-year-old me, if I was 30 and in that position, I would have been incredibly happy.
Right.
Right? And that would have been success beyond what I expected.
Right.
So the reason I ask myself that and remind myself that is that I'm super fortunate to be where I am.
Right, yeah.
Right? And even though, I've, again, been fortunate to earn more than that and to have been through an experience where I built a company and do all those things, that's way more than I would have expected at 15-year-old me, right? So it's a way of kind of staying grounded and also staying hungry, because you never know, you can't attach metrics and numbers to how you define your success. It's just you do the best you can at whatever opportunity you're pursuing and you give it your all, and then you let your path define it. And as long as you can look yourself in the mirror at the end of it and say you did what was right and you did the best, then that's success. And so for me, asking that question and thinking back to that conversation is always, it always also brings a sense of gratefulness for where I am.
No, that's amazing. And so if you could give advice to that 20-year-old self, given what you know now, or it could be that 20-year-old self's best friend who might need this advice, what advice would you give?
I would say it's a similar theme to what we've talked about, but a slight different variation, which is don't judge yourself based on what other people are doing, right? Again, fortunately, I think I learned that lesson and I started thinking about what I wanted. But it's a really, really, really hard thing to do a lot of reflection, to dig super deep and separate out what you want from what other people want or what you've been kind of programmed to think you want.
Right.
And the simplest first step is just don't compare yourself to others. You just compare yourself to your own growth. Whatever goal you set for yourself, are you able to achieve that? Are you able to be better than you were 6 months ago, a year ago, in whatever facet you want to measure? And that's how you grow, and that's how you achieve success. And so that's a super hard thing to do, and it's a lesson many people don't learn. I still have to remind myself all the time, but to me, that's the biggest piece of advice.
No, that's excellent. All right. Thank you so much for coming on this interview, and I think our audience would really find a lot of insight out of our chat today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no worries. So thanks for listening to the podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please check out other episodes, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date for the future episodes. Also, I would really appreciate it if you would leave a review on iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher, whichever is applicable to you. To see past episodes, you can go to oldmandan.com/podcasts. Also, you can sign up to my weekly newsletter on my blog, oldmandan.com/newsletter. You can stay up to date with future podcast episodes that way, and included in the newsletter are my book reviews I write, my weekly article related to the domain of self-development systems, as well as 7 things I learned throughout the week on being healthy, wealthy, and wise. Finally, special thanks to icons8.com for allowing me to use their music Tiny People on the podcast. Great. I will see you all next time. Take care.